Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I'm your host as always, Professor Prime. So let's talk about math and Final Fantasy and talk about some common themes, mechanics, and elements. So I have made a lot of videos about Final Fantasy, on Final Fantasy, and you know, it won't shock you, probably, that I am a big fan of the series. Just RPGs in general, but like especially Final Fantasy. It's been a big part of my life for quite some time, for over 20 years, which is bonkers, like since 2002. It started with 8, and I'll get to that in a bit. But there are some common themes, like, if you're playing the main games, and even in some games that are linked to it. Um, and just to start, I'll start with the combat, some basic things there, um, and then kind of build from that, right? And just kind of probably go off the rails. We'll see. So, and I've said this in some other videos when I'm talking about Final Fantasy before getting into like deeper territory. But there's the basic idea that you have your health. You're trying to either stay at 100% or that level, or at the very least you're trying to not reach 0% for your character or characters, right? You're trying to maintain your health while you're dishing out damage, right? So you want to get your opponent to 0% for their health, but not you, right? And then if you are taking damage, you want to be able to minimize that, heal from that, negate it, or recover and like rise up if it goes south and you do reach 0, right? And the idea is you have that basic premise, but you expand from there, right? So you have this idea that math is at its core, and then is you're attacking and getting attacked and all that stuff. You're typically gaining experience, right? And you're leveling up, and that idea is pretty consistent throughout Final Fantasy. Now, what's interesting is usually it's straight up leveling up in a way that you're used to, right? That you're getting experience points and you see an actual numerical level, right? But sometimes it's like just your stats are getting boosted or your weapons are getting boosted. And those are the things that you're seeing, and not necessarily that numerical value for level. But the idea is the same, that your stats are getting boosted no matter how you cut it in these games, right? Like that's pretty common, and the idea of stats themselves pretty common. Like not just with Final Fantasy, but RPGs too. And you can tie that up to a whole bunch of things, like notably, tabletop RPGs, right? But that idea of you attacking and maintaining your health while trying to get someone else's health to drop, that's pretty common. Stats are pretty common, and of those stats, there are some things that pop up because like the stats aren't the same in every Final Fantasy game, right? But you usually do have some that are really common, or there are some like equivalent stats in some different games, or they might be known by a different thing, or in some cases they might fuse some stats. But you often see, of course, like basic ones like your HP and your MP, um, but like strength, right? Attack, defense, magic attack, magic defense, and if not, those specifically some equivalent, right? Um, like the spirit stat can be a lot of different things, but that does show up and is usually tied to that idea of magic defense. Um, but my point is, stats are really common in a Final Fantasy game. So you have like math on a just really base level, where again you're dishing out damage while trying to avoid taking it, right? You're trying to stay at 100% while trying to drop someone else to 0%, or being able to recover from it. And you're getting experience points and you're leveling up. And whether you're leveling up in that direct sense, or leveling up your weapons, or just leveling up your stats in that more direct sense, the stats are getting boosted either way, right? And as you're doing that, you're navigating the game. You're getting more experience, you're defeating foes, you're progressing through the game. And as you do so, you are getting more equipment. And with that equipment, with the weapons, with the accessories that you gain, you're also able to boost your stats, gain different abilities, and then again, like better navigate the game. So you grow as you grow, right? And that's pretty common, as well as the idea of like resource management, collecting money, and all that stuff, and like having different types of abilities, regardless of what they're called in any given Final Fantasy game, is pretty common. And there's some that might require you to use X type of points, whatever they may be called in a given game, like ability points. But there may be some that just like you could do after a certain point, right? Like some different command moves, right? So you have like these really basic ideas, right? That are really fundamental to not only Final Fantasy, but also a lot of RPGs in general. And throughout the years, a lot of different games, a lot of different genres, and genre gets increasingly mean as time like progresses, but not necessarily in a bad way. Because I'm all for a lot of other games being like RPGs. Let them all be RPGs. Big fan, by the way, if you couldn't tell. But with that in mind, right? So all those things are pretty common. Like dishing out damage, trying to avoid taking it, having stats, being able to gain experience and level up. It may look different game to game, but that idea also, like, you're gaining weapons, you're gaining accessories, you're gaining equipments, and you're boosting your stats even further, and you can customize those as you go. Now, another big thing with Final Fantasy, and again, it's in other games too. And I'll get into some things that are like more specific to Final Fantasy in a little bit. But I just wanted to say, like, hey, these things are really common in any given Final Fantasy game. Whether we're talking about really old school, strict turn-based games, um, ones with the ATB system, and we'll get to that in a bit, or more real time, like whatever the type of style is going on there. A lot of these things are just there, and you feel it, right? Um, so you have all those things that I mentioned, right? It's not uncommon to have different jobs or different classes in Final Fantasy games. There are ones like the first one, like Final Fantasy One or Final Fantasy, whatever you want to say it, as there's games like that in Final Fantasy Three, Final Fantasy Five, and then just like a lot of other games periodically that deal with the idea of like classes or like jobs specifically. And then there are other Final Fantasy games where it's like it's lurking in the shadow, right? And the idea with jobs and classes and such is that you have these characters where even in games where you can still customize quite a bit, they have certain things that they might be good at, all right? Certain things they can do, right? You might have things like a warrior class or a mage, like and specifically there's different types of mage, right? Like you might have a black mage or white mage, red mage. In some cases, a blue mage. But the idea is like they all have different purposes. Like a warrior might have some higher stats that let them dish out more damage. A black mage is like dishing out more destructive magic. A white mage is dealing with more restorative magic. A red mage is kind of balanced. You might have a dragoon or like and I guess like with their stats that may vary, but they have different abilities that are unique to them, especially like the idea of a jump ability. Um, and I'm not as well versed with the whole blue mage thing, but from what I've seen, a lot of it is like being able to learn enemy attacks. But my point is, right, like you you have these different classes, and it can get interesting, right? So you can mix and match depending on if you can change your classes in those games or jobs in those games. And the idea is, hey, there are more. Some characters are more maybe more well versed in like their strength or their speed or their different abilities, and you can play around with that. And it's all math for the record, right? So like those are not uncommon. Whether you see like a game specifically refer to themselves as having jobs, right? It's not uncommon. And then you have the idea of some things where it starts to get a little bit more specific to Final Fantasy, but you still find in other games, like the idea of like summons. It's not uncommon for summon creatures to like be out there, but I do feel like with Final Fantasy, they're pretty distinctive, and there's some like long running ones. So like summons have been a big thing in Final Fantasy for quite some time, for a large amount of years, for most of Final Fantasy's duration, in fact. And whether you call them summons, espers, icons, guardian forces, whatever you want to call them. The idea is like you have these creatures that you can call forth, or summon into battle, right? Or in some cases, become them. And that's a whole nother thing. But the idea is, for a lot of them, you're dishing out like a crazy amount of damage when you summon them, and like maybe it costs you some MP, or maybe you have to get to a certain point in battle before you can use them or meet certain conditions. And for some, it's like, hey, it's one and done. You call them forth, one attack and it's done. Sometimes they might be out there for a while. And again, like there's a few games where you can become them, right? And that's pretty cool. But they're pretty common. Um, and so there's like the ATB system for a lot of Final Fantasy games. I mean, because it changes, right? There's some more strict turn-based games. ATB was pretty popular for a while, and it's that idea of like, hey, it's turn-based, but different things affect your ATB gauge, and like when it fills, you can attack, and you can do things to make that fill up faster, right? Or you can do things to slow down your opponents, right? That's pretty common. Limit breaks are pretty big, right? And they go by different names too, just like summons do, because it's like you can call them like limit breaks, which is the most popular thing. But also like desperation attack, trance states. I'd argue like the quickening from like Final Fantasy is the type, but the idea is like there are different things that you could do to activate a limit break, right? In a lot of cases, it's having damage done to you. But sometimes it might be like, hey, maybe you took an item, or maybe you have some magical state like Aura in Final Fantasy VIII that boosts that, or maybe I think because like what was it like I think in Final Fantasy X that got kind of crazy because like their versions of like limit breaks was like I think overdrive, right? And like it there was like different factors like you could get really specific what led to a limit break. It wasn't specifically damage, right? It could be, but it could also be dishing out damage, for instance, or like taking on certain status effects. But the idea is like having some sort of special technique that requires this or that to activate it is not uncommon. Limit breaks are often awesome, and they've been pretty ingrained in Final Fantasy. And a lot of these themes that I mentioned, like they show up in not all, but like a lot of them show up in different Final Fantasy games, and they're pretty common at this point. And I think that's worth noting because right, because I could play the old school Final Fantasy games or like a lot in the middle range or some of the ones down, and I could experience that like complete turn based. I can experience the ATB. I can experience that weird like kind of quasi real time in some of those other mid games. Like and I could also have that straight up real time, right? And no matter what's going on with how the action gets to you, the action at its core, it resonates pretty well over multiple Final Fantasy games. Like you could see something, you're like, oh, okay, I feel like that's Final Fantasy, right? And the worlds, the scale, the scope, the characters, and all that, it's like they have a certain feel to them, right? And I think that's cool. And so I've been talking about the combat for a while, but it's like it's not just that, right? There are of course like different creatures and different characters that show up that are like pretty commonplace. Right? If you have a Final Fantasy game and you somehow didn't have a Sid, I don't even know how that would work. Um, right? Because like Sid's pretty common, and for like summons that I mentioned, there are some summons that are pretty common, like Bahamut, Ifrit, Shiva, stuff like that. Then different types of items, um, are pretty common. Same with the money system, um, and also just like some certain themes of the games. Right, it's not uncommon to deal with like found family in Final Fantasy games. It's very common. There's also this big thing that like I'm sure some of you all have noticed while playing, but our characters usually confront some person or monster or literal god that has some issue with humanity or the world, and there's usually a fair amount of existentialism thrown in there just for good measure, sometimes straight up nihilism. And either they're literally fighting a god, like I said, or they're fighting someone who, eventually becomes a god, or someone has a stand in for like God or a god. There's a big thing on deicide in Final Fantasy games. Um, our characters do get OP though, right? Like, and they take it there. But like seriously speaking though, right? Like that's pretty common. Like, the types of opponents that you face. Like some do stand out, some are different. Um, but that is pretty common. And that, again, that idea of found family, and I think that's pretty cool too. Um, and you of course have some creatures that pop up like Tomberries and Marlboros and Chocobos. Chocobos being the more friendly of those. um, but yeah, so you get some pretty things that kind of like some pretty common things that like scream out Final Fantasy to me. And they're they don't feel out of place. And one thing that I don't really hear get discussed much. What I've noticed with some Final Fantasy games, a lot of Final Fantasy games, is like one, there's usually aliens in there somewhere. It's not completely unheard of in a Final Fantasy game. It ends up being way more common than you're probably thinking that it is. um, Time travel is less common, but it's there, and that's actually been there since the first game. So it's like when it comes up, I'm like, okay, that's not out of the realm of Final Fantasy. But sorry, words. I can speak school. One of the big things though that I noticed is there's usually an ancient civilization that had crazy high tech, and something happened to them. Either some like crazy existential threat wiped them out, or they wiped themselves out, or whatever the case may be. But they're usually like some civilization that was just like very advanced and like usually will explore some ancient realm and it's like got crazy tech in it. Like that's not that uncommon. That's something that I noticed that I don't really hear get talked about. So it's like, huh, interesting. Um, but yeah, so it's like there's a lot of things to me that show up in Final Fantasy games. Like they're not all the same, right? They all have their different combat systems. They all have different things that they bring to the table. But there are some things that are pretty common that pop up, and I'm cool with. You know. So I was trying to see if there's like anything else that I want to talk about for this. Not at the moment. I think I'm good. I'll see you in the future, Professor Rhyme out.